The Thief of Always, Chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6, Seen and Unseen. "Well," said Wendell as they ate, "what are you going to be tonight?" "I don't know," Harvey said. "What are you going to be?" "A hangman," he said with a spaghetti grin. "I've been learning how to tie nooses. Now all I've got to do is find someone to hang." He eyed Mrs. Griffin. "It's quick," he said. "You just drop 'em and snap. Their necks break." "That's horrible," Mrs. Griffin said. "Why do boys always love talking about ghosts and murders and hangings?" "Because it's exciting," Wendell said. "You're monsters," she replied with a hint of a smile. "That's what you are, monsters." "Harvey is," Wendell said. "I've seen him filing down his teeth." "Is it a full moon?" Harvey said, smearing ketchup around his mouth and putting on a twitch. "I hope so. I need blood. Fresh blood." "Good," said Wendell. "You can be a vampire. I'll hang 'em and you can suck their blood." "Horrible," Mrs. Griffin said again. "Just horrible." Perhaps the house had heard Harvey wishing for a full moon, because when he and Wendell traipsed upstairs and looked out of the landing window, there, hanging between the bare branches of the trees, was a moon as wide and as white as a dead man's smile. "Look at it," Harvey said. "I can see every crater. It's perfect." "Oh, that's just the start," Wendell promised, and led Harvey to a large, musty room which had been filled with clothes of every description. Some were hung on hooks and coat hangers. Some were in baskets like actors' costumes. Still more were heaped at the far end of the room on the dusty floor. And, half hidden until Wendell cleared the way, was a sight that made Harvey gasp. A wall covered from floor to ceiling with masks. "Where did they all come from?" Harvey said as he gaped at this spectacle. "Mr. Hood collects them," Wendell explained, "and the clothes are just stuff that kids who visited here left behind." Harvey wasn't interested in the clothes. It was the masks that mesmerized him. They were like snowflakes, no two alike. Some were made of wood and of plastic, some of strong cloth and papier-mâché. Some were as bright as parrots, others as pale as parchment. Some were so grotesque he was certain they'd been carved by crazy people. Others so perfect they looked like the death masks of angels. There were masks of clowns and foxes, masks like skulls decorated with real teeth, and one with carved flames instead of hair. "Take your pick," said Wendell. "There's bound to be a vampire somewhere. Whatever I come in here wanting to find, I find it sooner or later." Harvey decided to leave the pleasure of choosing a mask until last and concentrated instead on digging up something suitably bat-like to wear. As he worked through the piles of clothes, he found himself wondering about the children who'd left them here. Though he'd always hated history lessons, he knew some of the jackets and shoes and shirts and belts had been out of fashion for many, many years. Where were their owners now? Dead, he presumed, or so old it made no difference. The thought of these garments belonging to dead folk brought a little shudder to his spine, which was only right. This was Halloween, after all, and what was Halloween without a few chills? After a few minutes of searching, he found a long black coat with a collar he could turn up, which Wendell pronounced very vampiric. Well satisfied with his choice, he went back to the wall of faces, and his eyes almost immediately alighted upon a mask he hadn't previously seen, with the pallor and deep sockets of a soul just risen from the tomb. He took it down and put it on. It fitted perfectly. "What do I look like?" Harvey asked, turning to face Wendell, who found an executioner's mask which fitted him just as well. "Ugly as sin." "Good." There was a flickering family of pumpkin heads lined up on the porch when they stepped outside, and the misty air smelt of wood smoke. "Where do we go trick-or-treating?" Harvey wanted to know. "Out in the street?" "No," said Wendell. "It's not Halloween out in the real world, remember? We're going to go around the back of the house." "That's not very far," Harvey remarked, disappointed. "It is at this time of night," Wendell said creepily. "This house is full of surprises, you'll see." Harvey looked up at the house through the tiny eye holes of his mask. It loomed as large as a thunderhead, its weather vanes sharp enough to stab the stars. "Come on," said Wendell. "We've got a long trip ahead." A long trip, Harvey thought. How could it be a long trip from the front of the house to the back? But once again, Wendell was right. The house was full of surprises. The trip, which would have been a 2-minute walk in the bright afternoon, soon became a trek that had Harvey wishing he'd brought a torch and a map. The leaves rustled underfoot as though snakes were swarming through them. The trees that had shaded them by day now looked frightful in their nakedness, gaunt and hungry. Why am I doing this? He asked himself as he followed Wendell through the darkness. I'm cold, and I'm uncomfortable. He might have added frightened to the list, but he left that thought unsaid. As he was about to suggest they turn back, Wendell pointed up and hissed, "Look!" Harvey looked. Directly overhead, a form was moving silently against the sky, as if it had just launched itself from the eaves of the house. The moon had slunk away behind the roof and shed no light upon this night flyer, so Harvey could only guess at its shape from the stars it blotted out as it sailed. Its wings were wide, but ragged. Too ragged to bear it up, he thought. Instead, it seemed to claw at the darkness as it went, as though it were crawling on the very air itself. A glimpse was all Harvey had, then it was gone. What was that? He whispered. He got no answer. In the moments he'd taken staring up at the sky, Wendell had disappeared. Wendell, Harvey whispered, where are you? There was still no reply, just the slithering in the leaves and the moan of hungry branches. I know what you're doing, Harvey said, louder this time, and you won't scare me that easily. Hear me? This time there was a reply of sorts, not words, but a creaking sound from somewhere in the trees. He's climbing up into the treehouse, Harvey thought, and determined to catch Wendell and scare him back, he followed the sound. Despite the nakedness of the branches, their mesh kept all but a glimmer of starlight from falling on the groves. He slipped his mask down around his neck so as to see a little better, but even then he was nearly blind and had to listen out for the sound of Wendell's ascent to guide him. He could still hear the creaks plainly enough, and stumbled in their direction, his arms outstretched to grasp the ladder when he reached it. Now the sound was so loud he was certain he must be standing beneath the tree. He looked up, hoping to catch a glimpse of the trickster, but as he did so, something brushed his face. He snatched at it, but it was gone, at least for the moment. Then it came again, brushing his brow from the other side. He snatched at it a second time, then, as it touched him again, caught hold of it. Got you, he cried. His yell of triumph was followed by a rush of air, and the sound of something crashing to the ground at his side. He jumped, but refused to let go of whatever he was holding. Wendell? He called. By way of a reply, a flame flared in the darkness behind him, and a firework erupted into a shower of green sparks, its light making a gangrenous cavern of the grove. By its flickering light, he saw what he held, and seeing, let out a panicked yammering that had the crows rising from their roosts overhead. It was not a ladder he'd heard creaking. It was a rope. No, not even a rope, a noose, and in his hand, the leg of the man hanging from the noose. He let go of it and stumbled backwards, barely suppressing a second shout as his eyes rose to meet the dead man's stare. To judge by his expression, he had died horribly. His tongue lolled from his foamy lips, his veins were so swollen with blood his head looked like pumpkin. Either that, or it was a pumpkin. A fresh mountain of sparks now burst from the firework, and Harvey saw the truth of the matter. The limb he'd held was a stuffed trouser leg, the body a coat spilling bundles of clothes, that head a mask on a pumpkin, with cream for spittle and eggs for eyes. Wendell! He yelled, turning his back on the scene of execution. Wendell was standing on the far side of the firework, his ear-to-ear grin lit by its spitting sparks. He looked like a little demon fresh from the inferno. At his side, the ladder that had come crashing down to get the drama underway. I warned you, Wendell said, holding up his mask. I said I was going to be a hangman tonight. I'll get you back for this, Harvey said, his heart still beating too fast for him to see the funny side of this. I swear I'll get you back. You can try, Wendell crowed. The firework was beginning to fizzle out. the shadows around them beginning to deepen again. Had enough of Halloween for tonight? He asked. Harvey didn't much like admitting defeat, but he nodded grimly, swearing to himself that when he finally got his revenge, it would be choice. Smile, Wendell said, as the fountain of sparks dwindled. We're in the holiday house. The light had almost gone, and even though Harvey was still enraged at Wendell, and at himself for being such a sucker, he couldn't let it die away without making peace. All right, he said, allowing himself a tiny smile. There'll be other nights. Always, said Wendell. The reply pleased him. That's what this place is, he said, as the lights went out. It's the house of always. Chapter 7. A Present from the Past. There was a bonfire night supper waiting for them when they got back into the house. You look as though you've been in the wars, Mrs. Griffin remarked when she set eyes on Harvey. Has Wendell been up to his tricks? Harvey admitted that he'd fallen for all of them, but there was one that impressed him in particular. What was that? Said Wendell with a smug grin. The falling ladder? That was a clever little touch, wasn't it? No, not the ladder, said Harvey. What then? The thing in the sky. Oh, that. What was it? A kite? That wasn't my doing, Wendell replied. What was it then? I don't know, Wendell said, his smile disappearing. Better not to ask, eh? But I want to know, Harvey insisted, turning to Mrs. Griffin. It had wings, and I think it flew off the roof. Then it was a bat, Mrs. Griffin said. No, this was 100 times bigger than a bat. He spread his arms. Great dark wings. Mrs. Griffin frowned as Harvey spoke. You imagined it, she said. I did not, Harvey protested. Why don't you just sit down and eat, Mrs. Griffin replied. If it wasn't a bat then, it wasn't anything at all. But Wendell saw it too, didn't you, Wendell? He looked round at the other boy, who was digging into a steaming plate of turkey and cranberry sauce. Who cares, Wendell said, chewing as he spoke. Just tell her you saw it. Wendell shrugged. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't. It's Halloween night. There's supposed to be a boogeyman out there. But not real ones, said Harvey. A trick's one thing. But if that beast was real... As he spoke, he realized he was breaking the rule he'd made on the porch. Whether the winged creature was real or not didn't matter. This was a place of illusions. Wouldn't he be happier if he just stopped questioning what was real and what wasn't? Sit down and eat, Mrs. Griffin said again. Harvey shook his head. His appetite had disappeared. He was angry, though he wasn't quite sure at whom. Maybe at Wendell, for his shrugs, or at Mrs. Griffin for not believing him, or at himself for being afraid of illusions. Maybe all three. I'm going up to my room to change, he said, and left the kitchen. He discovered Lulu on the half landing, staring out of the window. Wind gusted against the glass, reminding Harvey of Rictus's first visit. It wasn't rain the gusts were bringing, however, it was powdery snow. It'll be Christmas soon, she said. Will it? There'll be presents for everyone. There always are. You should wish for something. Is that what you're doing? She shook her head. No, she said. I've been here so long I've got everything I ever wanted. Would you like to see? Harvey said yes, and she led him up the stairs to her room, which was immense and filled with her treasures. She obviously had a passion for boxes. Tiny, jeweled boxes, large, carved boxes, a box for her collection of glass balls, a box that played tinkling music, a box into which 100 smaller boxes fitted. She also had several families of dolls who sat in blank-faced rows around the walls. But more impressive by far was the house from which the dolls had been exiled. It stood in the middle of the room, 5 feet high from step to chimney top. Every detail of brick, slate, and sill perfect. This is where I keep my friends, Lulu said, and opened the front door. 2 bright green lizards came out to greet her, scurrying up her arms onto her shoulders. The rest are inside, she said. Take a look. Harvey peered through the windows and found that every perfect room in the house was occupied. There were lizards lounging on the beds, lizards snoozing in the baths, lizards swinging from the chandeliers. He laughed out loud at their antics. Aren't they fun? Lulu said. Great, he replied. You can come up and play with them any time you want. Thanks. They're really very friendly. They only bite when they're hungry. Here, she plucked one off her shoulder and dropped it into Harvey's hands. It promptly ran up and perched on his head, much to Lulu's amusement. They enjoyed the company of both the lizards and each other for a long while, until Harvey caught a glimpse of his reflection in one of the windows, and remembered what a sight he was. "I'd better go and wash," he told Lulu. "I'll see you later." She smiled at him. "I like you, Harvey Swick," she said. Her plainness made him plain. "I like you too," he told her. Then, his expression darkening, he said, "I wouldn't want anything to happen to you." She looked puzzled. "I saw you at the lake," he said. "Did you?" she replied. "I don't remember." "Well, anyway, it's deep. You should be careful. You could slip and fall in." "I'll be careful," she said as he opened the door. "Oh, and Harvey?" "Yes, don't forget to wish for something." What shall I ask for? He wondered as he washed the dirt off his face. Something impossible, maybe, to see just how much magic the house possessed. A white tiger, perhaps. A full-size Zeppelin? A ticket to the moon? The answer came from the depths of his memory. He'd wished for a present he'd been given, and lost, a long time ago. A present that his father had made for him, which Mr. Hood, however much he might want to please his new guest, would never be able to duplicate. "The Ark," he murmured. With his face washed and the scratches he'd got from the thorns in the thicket worn like war wounds, he headed back downstairs to find that once again the house had performed an extraordinary transformation. A Christmas tree, so tall that the star at its summit pricked at the ceiling, stood in the hallway, the colors of its twinkling lights seeping into every room. There was a smell of chocolate in the air and the sound of carols being sung. In the living room, Mrs. Griffin was sitting beside a roaring fire, with Stew Cat purring on her lap. "Wendell's gone outside," she told Harvey. "There's a scarf and gloves for you by the front door." Harvey went out onto the porch. The wind was icy, but it was already clearing the snow clouds, leaving the stars to shine down on a perfect white carpet. Not quite perfect. A trail of tracks led down from the house to the spot where Wendell was building a snowman. "Coming out?" he shouted to Harvey, his voice as clear as the bells that were ringing through the crisp air. Harvey shook his head. He was so tired, even the snow looked comfortable. "Maybe tomorrow," he said. "It'll be back tomorrow, won't it?" "Of course," Wendell yelled. "And the night after? And the night after?" Harvey went back inside to look at the Christmas tree. Its branches were hung with strings of popcorn and tinsel, with colored lights and baubles and soldiers in gleaming silver uniforms. "There's something under there for you," Mrs. Griffin said, standing at the living room door. "I hope it's what you want, sweet." Harvey knelt down and pulled a parcel with his name on it out from under the tree. His pulse quickened before he even opened it, because he knew from its shape, and from the way it rattled, that his wish had been answered. He pulled at the string, remembering as he did so how much littler his hands had been the first time he'd held this gift. The paper tore and fell away, and there, shiny and new, was a painted wooden ark. It was a perfect copy of the one his father had made. The same yellow hull, the same orange prow, the same wheelhouse with holes in its red roof for the drafts to put their heads through. The same lead animals, all in pairs, snug in the hold or peering through the portholes. 2 dogs, 2 elephants, 2 camels, 2 doves. All these and a dozen more. And finally, the same little Noah with his square white beard and his fat wife, complete with apron. "How did he know?" Harvey murmured. He hadn't intended the question to be heard, much less answered, but Mrs. Griffin said, "Mr. Hood knows every dream in your head." "But this is perfect," Harvey said in amazement. "Look. My dad ran out of blue paint when he was finishing the elephants, so one of them has blue eyes and the other one has green eyes. It's the same. It's exactly the same." "Does it please you, then?" Mrs. Griffin asked. Harvey said it did, but that wasn't entirely the truth. It was eerie to have the ark back in his hands when he knew the real one had been lost, as though time had been turned on its heels, and he was a little kid again. He heard Wendell stamping the snow off his feet at the front door and was suddenly embarrassed to have such a childish present in his hands. He gathered it up in its wrapping and hurried away upstairs, intending to head back down for some supper. But his bed looked too welcoming to be refused, and his stomach quite full enough for one night. So instead, he closed the curtains on the gusty night and laid his head down on his pillow. The Christmas bells were still ringing in some distant steeple, and their repetition lulled him into sleep. He dreamt that he was standing on the steps of his house, looking through the open door into its warm heart. Then the wind caught hold of him, turning him from the threshold and carrying him away into a dreamless sleep.